Okay, we're good to go.
Okay. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. If you could just let us know in the chat feature where you're coming from, if you have already, thank you so much. So far, the big winner is from Louisiana as the farthest virtually traveled this evening. So if there's anybody from further than that, please let us know that you're here. But we appreciate everybody joining us this evening for the Earth Day at Home webinar series. Tonight is the 9th weekly event in our series. We only have a couple more weeks to go. And tonight's speaker is Michele Bakacs, and she'll be talking about Compost 101. So basically everything you wanted to know about composting but were afraid to ask. Keys to Successful Composting, that's the official title for her talk. So my name is Steve Yerzo. I'll be the moderator. I'll be handling questions from people. If you do have any questions tonight, please go ahead and put them into the chat feature. We have a couple of people who are going to also be answering questions during the talk as we're able to, but we will stop every couple of slides to ask Michele some questions in case you have any of great importance that you want answered, so feel free to do so. I do need to let you know that we are recording tonight's session, so we will be recording this. So please be careful, what gets included in the chat, because we saved that as well, too. The recordings will be available in a couple of days on the same website where you registered through the Rutgers Environmental Stewards Program, so please be sure to check back there in a couple of days. We will also be sending out a follow-up email to you guys with more resources and information on it from Michele's talk, including the slides. So if you are going to be asking, will you be able to get the slides, you will be able to get the slides from everybody from tonight's talk, and we will send that out to everybody. So for those of you who are familiar with Cooperative Extension, we're glad you could join us again and that you participate in these programs, but Cooperative Extension is basically the outreach arm of Rutgers University. So we take what's learned at the university and researched and studied, and we bring it out to the quote-unquote real world. So we teach everybody that doesn't pay tuition to go to Rutgers. So we teach the general public, we teach municipal officials, we teach other environmental organizations, we teach other educators, et cetera, about different programs that we're involved with. Mostly our group, who has been coordinating the Earth Day at Home series, deals with natural resources. So we figured we might as well talk about how to save some of those natural resources by being a successful composter and doing some recycling of food waste. Also, just to let you know, we do these programs for free, but we do ask that if you are able to, during this trying time, during this difficult time, this uncertain time, that if you're able to give us a donation, that we ask you to do so to the Environmental Stewards Program to help pay for scholarships and projects that we do with the stewards to help them, earn their certificate and to move forward, and also to provide other educational opportunities like this one. I will put into the chat the directions on how to actually do the donation, including the link to the account where you can donate to. So please do that for us tonight. But tonight we have Michele Bakacs, who is the environmental agent and county agent for Middlesex and Union counties, here to talk to us about making everyone a successful composter. So Michele, I am done with my introduction, so if you are ready, the floor is yours.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. All right.
I just want to jump in before you get started, just to let you all know that we will be conducting a poll towards the end of this talk, where we will be asking you some questions and to evaluate this talk as well. So I forgot to mention that. So take it away, Michele, for real now.
Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Earth Day at Home. I'm excited to talk to you guys about one of my favorite topics, composting. We've been composting at my house for, I guess, about 10 years, and then I had to very seriously learn about composting. I was doing a lot of work in some urban areas, in New Brunswick area, and there was some issue with, I was teaching people about gardening and contaminated soils, and one of the best ways to remediate contaminated soils is to use compost, organic matter. So I had to learn quickly how to be a good composter. So tonight is a very basic. We're going to go into the basics of composting. So I bet there's lots of folks out there of varying degrees of composting understanding. You'll get something out of this if you're a beginner. And hopefully, if you've been composting for a while, then hopefully you'll just learn how to make your system better. This says Rutgers Community Garden Series because parts of this talk were originally done for a completely different webinar series, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that at the end. So before we jump in, I have to show you this very, very wordy slide. It will
You froze up, Michele. Looks like we're having technical difficulties with Michele's signal.
all of you, but we need
We lost your audio, Michele. I don't know if you can hear me.
to take part in.
Okay. We lost you as soon as you started to talk about what this slide is.
Okay, hold on one moment, see if that works. Is that better?
Yep. Yes, it is. Oh, you froze up again.
How's that? Is that better?
For me, it is.
How about it for other folks? Yeah?
I see a yes, a yes, yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. All right, so then I'm gonna just start over again, okay? Looks like it's good for everyone so far. I see in and out. Steve, I sound good to you?
Yep, it's good for me.
All right. Okay, then I'm just gonna keep going. And then I have my phone right here. If for some reason there's an issue, you can go ahead and text me also if I'm not responding, if I'm just sitting here talking to myself. Okay, so I'm going to start over. This slide here is just to let you know that, just to request your permission, Rutgers considers the poll that we do and then the follow-up survey that we do later on to be research. So we need your participation and we need your consent to be part of that research study. So you'll be sent this language. It basically has the description of what the poll says. Know that it is completely voluntary. You do not have to take part in the poll. And if you have any specific questions, you can call IRB. The information is here. You can also reach out to Amy, but you will be sent all this information. It's just basically to get your permission to take part in the poll. Okay, so this is actually my last slide. I don't mean it's my last slide like I won't be, presenting any more slides. I mean it's my 34th slide. It's the slide from later on at the end. And I put this right here at the beginning because I want you to all understand, if you don't currently compost, I want you to understand that composting is incredibly easy. I've listened into a lot of composting talks, and I've given a lot of talks on composting, and I sometimes find that people make it more complicated than it is, and I was accused recently of making it more complicated than it needed to be. So I want to emphasize as much as possible that there are just four main ingredients. You need brown material, you need green material, we will talk about what that is, you need oxygen, and then you also need water. And you mix those together and you get compost. It may take some time, but you're going to get compost. So if at any time during this presentation it seems like, I don't know, it's too much, it's information overload, or I don't know, it seems like it's more than you wanted to get involved with, just remember this slide and remember that it's incredibly easy, and no matter what method that you use, I'm sure that you're going to be successful with your composting. Okay, so let's start out with some basics. What is composting? Composting, as it says in this slide here, is a natural process. We're taking advantage of what naturally goes on in the soil, the soil food web. I'll talk about that in a second, but composting is a natural process where organic materials decompose and are recycled into this dark, rich, earthy, crumbly material known as compost. And please know that compost is considered a soil conditioner. It conditions the soil. It is not considered a fertilizer. Sometimes people make that mistake. It actually has backyard compost bins where you're composting vegetable scraps and maybe leaves. Actually has relatively low nutrient levels, so it's not a fertilizer. It's more of a soil conditioner. And as far as how we compost or the organisms that are involved with compost, this is the soil biology part of it. Lots of different organisms are involved with composting. Worms, insects, microorganisms, bacteria, fungi. I want you guys to consider the microorganisms in the pile. They're your team. They are like, you think of yourself as a farmer. And what you're really doing when you're composting is you're raising microorganisms. And it is your job as the compost farmer to make the ideal conditions so that all these microorganisms and the earthworms and the bacteria and fungi all want to thrive. So this diagram here, diagram of the soil food web. And the soil food web, this particular diagram is from the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, and you can find this on their website. It's just a basic diagram of the soil food web, and this is what's going on all the time in the soil, and we take advantage of this process when we compost. Okay, so if you are a teacher or you know teachers, if you teach about food web, teaching about the soil food web is a wonderful way for kids to understand ecosystem cycles, the cycling of nutrients, and the cycling of energy through a food web. So the food web is made up of different trophic levels. The basis of the soil food web is the plants. These are the photosynthesizers, and they get decomposed by the second trophic level, which is fungi and bacteria, and then those energy is being transferred through the food web, and those fungi and bacteria are being broken down by a higher order trophic level, so the protozoa and nematodes, which are these microscopic little worms, and the protozoa, which are these single cells. Maybe you remember in biology putting soil under a microscope and seeing these little organisms, scurrying around. Those are the amoeba and the flagellates, and they're in there too. And all of these organisms are incredibly important for breaking down the material that's in your compost bin. And then you get into the higher order trophic levels, like the higher order predators. Earthworms are in here too. That's all part of the soil food web. And there is, you put into a search engine, soil food web, you will find a ton of information, and it's very interesting. Right now, soil biology and soil food web is a very kind of hot topic right now. So really quickly, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't think that there were benefits of compost, but just going over some of the benefits of composting. Compost improves the soil structure or the workability of the soil by providing organic matter to the soil. So that's incredibly important. If you remember back from Steve's talk, Steve talked about the different parts of the soil. You remember it's sand, silt, and clay, and there's pore spaces and water, but there's also the organic portion of the soil. Adding compost to the soil helps increase organic matter. And typical urban degraded soil has about a 1% or a 2% organic matter. But healthy soil should be in maybe like the 4% or even up to 5% range for organic matter. So adding compost also helps to increase aeration, which helps stimulate healthy root development. It increases water drainage. So if you have more clay soils, If you have more clay soils, then adding compost to the soil can help water drain. But on the other hand, if you have sandier soils, if you're in South Jersey, for example, adding compost to the soil can also help with retain moisture. Other benefits of compost, it promotes those beneficial soil organisms that we were talking about earlier. So this is also very important, especially if you want to do any sort of organic gardening or organic landscaping, making sure that you have good soil biology and those organisms in the soil is very important. If you, for example, want to use a organic fertilizer, then you need those organisms in the soil to help break down those natural organic fertilizers and make it available, make those nutrients available for plant uptake. Adding compost helps to control soil acidity. So compost has a slightly neutral pH, and so for the most part, so if you have a tendency to have more acidic soil, compost can help correct there. It also, as I said earlier, it helps reduce our exposure to soil contaminants. And then, as Amy pointed out, when you heard her talk a few weeks back, it helps reduce garbage in our landfills. So this is a pie chart of the total municipal solid waste generation. And as you can see here, like about a third of this pie chart, the food and the yard trimmings are considered organics. And that is a large portion of the waste stream that could be made into compost, whether or not you're bringing yard trimmings to a composting facility in your town, or if you're doing backyard food composting. So any questions so far?
Nothing yet. I did just put out a call to people that if they did have questions to throw them into the chat. But we haven't gotten anything so far. Let me double check.
Okay, good. More so, I was actually a little, I was just seeing if the audio was okay. So I'm just that I'm not sitting here talking to myself.
Yep.
So we're going to get into later what's okay to compost and what's not okay to compost if I see some of those questions coming through. So hold your questions for just a second until we get to that part. So there are many different composting techniques. I have a tendency to be a lazy composter, and the lazy composting technique is you add the material to a pile, you set the compost where it will get wet, and then in about a year, maybe a year and a half, you'll have yourself some compost. And if that's how you roll, then that's great. But just know that with just a little bit more work and a little bit more attention to detail, not much, you can have compost a lot sooner. You just have to be willing to be patient and also to experiment with the materials that you have and the system that you have. Okay, this is incredibly important. When you read about composting, what they always emphasize is, yes, there's a lot of science that goes into composting, but it's actually more of an art form and really just understanding the materials that you have to compost with. All right, so let's make some compost. So go ahead and tell me in the chat box, what are some items that can be composted? If you're already composting, what are you composting with? Or what are some items that you think or maybe you've heard of that could be composted? Cardboard, yes. Newspaper, fruits, vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, yes. Eggshells, spoiled fruits, yep. Leaves, yes. Now I'm starting to see the browns. So far I'm seeing a lot of fresh green material, grass clippings, newspaper, leaves, cut grass, hay. This is great. Okay. So yes, that is a lot of the material that you can compost with. So we break up the ingredients, the compost ingredients, into two categories. The most important category, as far as I'm concerned, is the brown category, your brown materials. And the reason why I say this is because often when we see compost marketing, it's often geared towards, hey, you can compost all your fresh vegetables or your fruit scraps. And they make you think that that's all you need is the fresh material. And that is really not true. And you need a lot more of the brown carbon-rich materials than your fresh nitrogen-rich green materials. So brown materials are your dry materials. It's your leaves, hay, shredded newspaper, wood shavings, shredded cardboard. Those are our carbon-rich materials, and those are what we consider to be our brown materials. But then you also need green materials, which are our nitrogen-rich materials. And that's your kitchen scraps, your vegetable and fruit scraps, your coffee grinds. Notice that even though coffee is brown, the color brown, it's still considered a green material because it is a fresh material. Grass clippings are also considered a green material. And then weeds without seed heads that are not invasive are also can be used to compost with. And there's lots of other stuff, right? There's pasta. You can compost pasta if you wanted to without any sort of butter or grease or anything like that. There's things I saw lint from your dryer, which yes you can do, but just know that there's a lot of polyester in that lint. So just know that that's plastic. So you may not necessarily want to put your dryer lint in your compost bin. Most importantly, you want to cut up everything for faster decomposition. You want to increase the surface area of a lot of these materials. So one time I opened up a compost bin and I saw an entire watermelon rind that was inside. I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, that watermelon rind will break down eventually, but if they had just cut that up into maybe, 1-inch square pieces, it would break down a lot quicker. As far as how small to break it up, it's just as small as what you have time for. Okay, so tell me some items that cannot be composted. Now in the chat box, go ahead and tell me some items. Meat, that's right. Grease, animal products, bones, yep. Okay, so it sounds like, yep, dog poop should not be composted, right? Glass obviously should not be composted. Nothing oil-based. Cat litter, right? No cat litter. Okay, so here are some of the items that cannot be composted. Meat, oil, grease, animal feces, any plants with disease on it, seed heads of weeds, and avoiding fruit and vegetable seeds. This is incredibly important because I want you to think the compost bin is not a garbage can. And sometimes I see people make the mistake of thinking that they can just put anything in there, and that is not true. And the reason why is because your backyard compost bin is, you're not a commercial composter. You're probably not going to hit the temperatures that are needed in order to kill diseases and the seed heads of weeds. So just know this. I want you to think about this when you are composting. And I hope from here on, and if you're already composting or moving forward, you will be very picky about what you put into your compost bin. Commercial compost operations, in order just to call their product compost, they have to keep their compost between 130 and 170 degrees for 3 days to kill pathogens and weed seeds. So unless you know that you're hitting, you need about 140 degrees in order to kill weed seeds and pathogens. So unless you know that you're hitting those numbers and your compost bin is getting really, really hot, you want to avoid plants with diseases, any sort of seed in there, anything like that, because they're going to stick around and they're going to end up in your garden. Okay, so
Michele,
yeah.
can I interrupt with a couple of questions, because I think the last 2 slides generated a lot of interest as to what can and can't be put into a compost. So we did have some people asking about some various items that were not mentioned, but a couple of people did want to ask, could you just define or describe what you mean by when you're talking about the seed heads of the invasive plants?
Okay, so just no seeds in general. So you know how plants go to seed? like for example, I have some asters in my garden going to seed. If you consider that a weed, you wouldn't pull out those weeds and then put them in your compost bin if they're going to seed. The other thing is you wouldn't put in is, for example, rotting fruits. For example, the little cherry tomatoes that a lot of people have in their gardens, because those have seeds in them, and they're not going to decompose. They're probably not going to be killed in your backyard compost bin. You're just not going to hit the temperatures that are needed.
Okay.
The plant itself, yes, it can go in, but not the seeds.
Okay. So I think that the next couple of ones are just a rapid fire yes or no. Can this be added to a compost pile? A couple of people asked about hair.
Yes.
Okay. Someone asked about pine needles and the potential for making it too acidic.
Right. So you want to be careful with that kind of thing. I may, in my chart later on, I may have pine needles on there. This just goes back to just knowing what you're composting with and knowing the carbon to nitrogen ratio. I, unfortunately, have to compost with, for example, a lot of oak leaves, and they have a lot of tannins, and they break down slowly. So that's just the materials that I have at my disposal to compost with. So there's lots of information out there on pine needles. You know, you can do a quick search online. You wouldn't want to use a lot of them, and you want to just do some research to figure out if you have pine needles, what is the best companion material that you could add to your compost bin so that you could successfully compost.
So some of the people were asking about the type of newspaper, like shiny versus like a regular newsprint newspapers. Can the shiny stuff?
Right. No shiny stuff, no,
okay.
Nothing like that, but just regular newspaper. You can, I know sometimes people have concerns about the color, but a lot of times now the newspaper ink is a soy-based ink, and you can put that color into the compost bin. You would just want to shred it up and realize that newspaper, you know, has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Higher lignin, you know, content. So it may take longer. It will take longer to break down.
Okay. And finally, and then I'll let you continue on. People have been asking a lot about seafood products like shrimp shells or fish. Can that be put into compost?
In a backyard compost bin, you would want to avoid anything like that. You would want to avoid any sort of meat or oil, grease, shells, things like that. The reason why is because you run the risk of attracting vermin or raccoons or something like that to your compost pile. If you are out in the middle of nowhere, if you can create a great big pile and you know that your temperatures are getting pretty high, if you can bury that material really deep, then that's a different story. But in general, for the most part, for most of us, we have these smaller little compost bins, and adding any of those materials to there is just going to attract the wrong kind of action to your backyard.
Okay.
Anything else?
Thank you very much, Michelle.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. Good.
Okay, so this is what finished compost looks like. Hold on one second. I think I may have skipped. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped a point that I wanted to make on here. So hold on one second. Let me go back. Okay, so we talked about heat. We talked about the importance of heat in the compost pile, and your compost pile will generate heat. It's very exciting when that happens, to turn the compost pile and to see the steam coming off of there. But most likely you won't generate the kind of heat that you need. I think I've beaten that point to death. Okay, so now we've talked about brown material. We've talked about our green material. Now let's talk about the other two ingredients, water and air. Water is very important. You need moisture in your compost pile because the organisms in your pile, they need moisture in order to thrive. When a pile dries out, the pile will just go dormant, you know, or those organisms are going to go someplace else. So very, very important that you monitor your compost pile and make sure that it is moist. How moist? When you grab some of the material, and squeeze it, a couple of drops should come out. You don't want to flood it. You just want to make sure that it's coated with water and there's a nice film of water to keep those organisms happy, keep your team happy. The other thing is that this is an aerobic process. So air is incredibly important to these organisms. If you don't have oxygen in your pile, then you're going to attract the anaerobic organisms are going to thrive, and then it's going to be a hot, stinky mess of sulfur and ammonia, and you don't want that. So in order to get air into your compost bin, you've probably guessed that you need to turn that pile. And in the summer months, you turn the pile about once a week. And again, this goes back to composting being an art form. You will make a determination based on your materials that you are composting, how often you need to turn it. But in general, in the summer, it's about once a week. In the winter, you can get away with turning it less because you want to keep that heat in the pile. You turn it too often, and then you're gonna lose that heat, which is incredibly important. So again, for composting, you need your browns, you need your greens, you must have water, and you must have air. These 4 ingredients are the basic tenets of composting. Everything else I'm going to talk about is really just tips and tricks for helping you have compost sooner. So this is finished compost. This is what your finished compost should look like. And finished compost should have a deep, earthy, rich-smelling. It should be rich-smelling material. It should have no remnants of the original material in it. You can see in here there's a couple little sticks, a couple little other things that haven't broken down. But in general, you should not be able to recognize the original ingredients that you put in the pile. Notice that dark, rich color, and it doesn't have any odor. Elaine Ingham, who's a famous soil biologist, I once read that she said that finished compost should be the color of a 70% chocolate bar. And I agree with that, having seen finished compost. And so this is what it should look like in case you've never seen finished compost before. A nice thing to do, and I think I have it later, is if you do, if you have your compost product, you can put it through a screen. You can put it through a compost screen in order to get out some of the larger materials that haven't completely composted yet. I think I have a slide on that later. Okay, so now we're going to dive in a little to how much green and how much brown. Okay, so we'll dive into a little bit on some of the science behind this. So the microorganisms in your pile need carbon for energy, and then they need nitrogen for protein synthesis. So if you're a runner or if you're an athlete, if you've done any sort of exercise, you often hear that I am a runner, so I'm often carbing up before a race. And I need those carbohydrates, I need that carbon for energy. But then after my race, after I run, I come back and I want to have something that's protein rich. And that protein is very important for muscle recovery. The organisms in your compost bin are exactly the same. You need this proper carbon to nitrogen ratio in order for these organisms to thrive. And it turns out that researchers have been able to show that the ideal ratio of carbon to nitrogen in a compost pile is about 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, and that's by dry weight. I want you to remember that. This is by dry weight, because I'm going to ask you something later on. Okay, so let's look at some of the carbon to nitrogen ratios of different types of materials. So at the top here are our nitrogen, we call this our nitrogen-rich material. So notice the carbon to nitrogen ratios at the top here. So vegetable scraps are considered to be a nitrogen-rich material. They vary. It can be between 12 to 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Fresh grass clippings are also nitrogen-rich, 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Look at coffee grounds, also 20 to 1. Look at poultry manure. Sometimes people ask me if they can put the chicken manure. It is also incredibly nitrogen-rich. And then as we go down this chart, the carbon to nitrogen ratio increases. So we're getting into our browns down here. At the top, we have our green, our nitrogen-rich material. And at the bottom, once you get into 60 to 1, now you're in your browns, your carbon-rich material. So leaves, look at leaves. Leaves are 60 to 1. Newspaper varies widely, 50 to 200 to 1. It's a really carbon-rich material. Here's our pine needles. That can really vary also. And then straw, and check out sawdust. That depends on the type of tree that sawdust is from, but it can be anywhere from 100 to 500 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Okay, so that just gives you an idea that different materials have different carbon to nitrogen ratio. So say you decide that you want to try to hit that perfect 30 to 1, that perfect 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. How would you go about doing that? Well, in this example, what we're going to use, say we're composting with fresh grass clippings and dry leaves. So we're using our fresh grass clippings as our high nitrogen-rich material and the dry leaves as our carbon-rich material. So if you wanted to hit that perfect 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, here's what you would do. Here's the math. You would combine 2 bags, let's call them leaf bags, say they're leaf bags, 2 bags of fresh grass clippings and 1 bag of dried leaves. And then the math is 20 to 1 plus 20 to 1 plus 60 to 1 equals about 30 to 1, 33 to 1 actually, but you're hitting about 30 to 1, okay? So now I ask you, I'm making this big deal. I've made this big deal that you need more carbon-rich materials than nitrogen-rich materials. If that's the case, why are we using 2 bags of fresh grass clippings and only 1 bag of dried leaves? Can anybody guess? Right, the weight. What about the weight specifically? Right, the water content. Yes, grass is heavier. There we go. Fresh grass clippings are heavier. Yes, fresh grass clippings have like an 85% water content. It's mostly water, which is why we all should just be leaving our grass clippings on the lawn because they will decompose very, very quickly. So what's going to happen with those 2 bags of fresh grass clippings is they are going to go down to almost nothing. And so I bring this up not because I want you to get caught up in these numbers, but more because I want you to understand just how much more carbon-rich material you need than nitrogen-rich material. Again, this is a mistake I often see people make, is that they don't put enough, for example, leaves or some other carbon-rich material into their compost bin, and they assume that they can just compost with fresh vegetable scraps and fruit scraps. Okay? So what I want you guys to start thinking about, if you did not know this, and if you're thinking you may need to make a change in your compost bin, I want you to start thinking about where are you going to start stockpiling your browns. Okay, this is my compost. This is my compost setup in my backyard. It's a little bit messy. Benjamin, my 9-year-old, is in charge of the compost operation right now, and he's actually on strike because Steve and I were saying earlier that he's forming a union because I have not taken out the finished compost from the bottom. So here is where I stockpile my leaves, on the left here where that arrow is, and the right is where all the composting action is going on. So every time Benjamin takes, we keep like a little 1 gallon bucket on our kitchen counter, and that's where we put our food scraps, our vegetable scraps. And then Benjamin goes out and he dumps it, and he knows that when he dumps one of those big 1 gallon containers, he's got to take a big handful of leaves and also add that to the pile every single time. So some of you may be thinking, where am I going to get my browns from? Where am I going to get leaves? It's June. Where am I going to get leaves from? Well, you know those leaves that are stuck under your deck that you've been avoiding raking out? This may be the time to go and start raking out those leaves. But then also in the fall, you know, I am the one who's walking down my street at night stealing everybody's leaves from my neighbors. They know to keep the leaves from me because this is an issue. I need leaves for my compost, and that's what I compost with. I compost with leaves and vegetable scraps from our kitchen. Those are the materials that I use. And it's mostly oak leaves in our neighborhood. Also, we've got some sweet gum leaves also. Okay? So that's what I want you to start thinking about. Where am I going to start keeping my brown material that I'm going to add when I dump my fresh vegetables? Okay, Steve, questions?
Yes, we've had a bunch. There's been a grouping of them about people concerned about wildlife and whether or not the compost will attract.
Let's hold the wildlife. Let's hold the wildlife. So let's light on wildlife. We'll get to that later.
Okay. There were some other questions about other materials that can go into the compost pile. Somebody was asking about like sticks and twigs, but I think you showed some in the compost picture that you had previously.
Right. I mean, sticks and twigs are great for aeration. It depends how big your pile is. You saw my compost setup. I can't really fit, sticks and twigs in there. So that's something that I bring to my town to compost. Also, it's going to take a while for wood. It takes a long time to break down. You could add some in there just to get some aeration in the pile, but just know it's going to be a while for those twigs to break down.
Okay. And somebody asked about paper towels and napkins.
Yeah. Paper towels. I add paper towels to the bin, and napkins also. You just want to make sure there's no grease or anything on there.
Okay. And someone asked also about fireplace ashes.
Okay, that's a great question. So the ash from fireplace is actually it has the same acidity as like lime, so it's very alkaline. So I wouldn't advise putting that in the pile, at least not very much. That's not something that you would want to do on a regular basis because you would really kind of mess with the acidity of your compost bin. Other questions before I go on? One comment, how do I turn my compost? I use a pitchfork. I think I may have a picture later of it. That is my tool of preference, but there's other, they make all sorts of tools out there. I don't like using a shovel. I really do like using a pitchfork.
And someone else asked about the setup in terms of adding new material. It looked like in your setup that you had a couple of stations, so.
Right. Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. We're going to talk about different composting setups and different systems. Right, the way I compost, I'm constantly adding material to the pile, and that's fine because I have a specific bin that is meant for that. The turning of the compost happens kind of at the top of the bin, and all of the finished compost drops out to the bottom. So that's how it's designed. And we'll talk about some systems that are not set up that way, and you just have to realize that when you set up your compost system. Okay?
All right. So, all right. There are some others, but I think you might be covering them in a few slides, so feel free to go ahead and continue.
Okay, great. So where to locate your pile? You should locate your pile where it is most convenient for you to compost. I have friends who have a compost bin. It's like all the way far on the other side of their yard, and the two of them just argue about who has to put out the compost. So don't be that guy. Just put the compost bin where it is most convenient for you. Some other things to think about. It's great if you can put it in the shade because when it's in the hot sun, it dries out quickly. You should have it close to a water source, like a hose, so you can, keep it moist. And then you don't want to put it any place where there's any sort of poor drainage or flooding. And then you don't want to put it right on top of tree roots or right next to a wooden building because the wood may rot. All right. So how big of a pile? So your pile should be no smaller than 3 by 3 by 3 feet. And that's very important because you need to generate enough heat. You need to maintain sufficient mass in your compost bin in order for the microorganisms to thrive and also for the heat to stay in that pile. But then you don't want it larger than 5 by 5 by 5 because then it just becomes unruly and you can't turn it. And I see this a lot in community and school gardens where someone has just created a huge compost bin for them and nobody can get in and turn it. So now look at this bin here. Look at this turning bin with the question mark on it. I've seen those turning bins are very convenient, but a lot of times they're just very small. This one, for example, is too small. It's convenient because it's at a school and it's easy for the kids to turn, but it's just too small to generate the amount of heat that you're going to need to compost efficiently. So speaking of heat, why does the pile get hot? So it gets hot because the carbon material in the pile is oxidized to carbon dioxide, and then that energy is released by the byproduct in the form of heat. And when I'm teaching this to kids, I tell them it's like when you're running outside at recess and you run around and you get all sweaty and hot. The same thing is happening in the compost bin. Those microorganisms are working really, really hard to break down that material, and heat is generated as a byproduct. All right, so here's some examples of compost bins. This is a typical compost bin, similar to the one I showed you before. Here's a pitchfork on the right here. That's a short pitchfork. That's one of my favorite tools to use. This is a great system. I like systems that have a great big, large, wide top for you to put the compost in. Also, this is a good system because it has a lock at the top. It's not locked now, but it does have a lock, so you can avoid any wildlife getting in there. And then also the nice thing, here's mine. I have a similar system. So the nice thing about this system is that at the bottom you have this door that you can open and you can take out the finished compost. And as I said earlier, the way I compost, I'm always adding stuff to my compost bin, and that works fine for this kind of setup. You add it to the top, you add your leaves, your food scraps, you're mixing at the top, and then the finished compost is coming out at the bottom. But not every system works that way. Oh, here is the picture of the compost screener. You can easily make this. You can purchase it online, but you can easily make this using hardware cloth. And this is a nice thing to do to sift the compost through the hardware cloth, so that the finished compost falls out, and then the material that hasn't composted you can put back in the compost bin. So here's some other compost bins. I know people like those turning bins, like the one you see on the left and the bottom left here. If you're going to get a system like that, just make sure that it's large enough. You know, this one here is very big. That would be fine, but the one on the right here, the top right turning bin, that probably would not be big enough. Also, with these systems, these are kind of designed so that you put the material in there, and then when you generate enough material, you shut the system down, and you don't add any more material to it. That's the way these systems, that was the original purpose of these types of systems. You put the material in, maybe you stockpile it, or maybe you add it, and then when you have enough, you shut it down and you don't add anything else to it. You just let it cook. You let it do its thing, and eventually you get compost. Here's some other, homemade compost bins. You can easily make a compost bin with like some hardware cloth and some stakes on the right here. You can also use wooden pallets. These are great because, like the black one you saw earlier, air can get in through the sides, through the slats on the sides, and that's what you want. You want oxygen to be able to get into the compost pile. This is also a nice way to stockpile leaves if you wanted to. So then here are some other systems. These systems also are meant to, you add your material to it, and then you turn it and keep it moist, and then you let it cook. You shut them down until they're done. Especially this system on the bottom right here, the one with the 3 bins. I see these a lot in community and school gardens, but oftentimes people don't realize how they're supposed to work, and they just put all of the material into all 3 bins. But with these types of systems, you have to shut down one of these bins and let it cook, and then you put your material in another one of those bins, and then the third one is for the place where you can get your finished compost from. So in these types of systems, you're really not meant to continually add your ingredients to it. They have to be shut down at some point. So it may be helpful to have a second compost container. The troubleshooting, there's really no problem compost, there's never a compost emergency unless it's on fire, and you don't want that to happen. But I doubt that would happen with a backyard compost bin. You hear those stories about compost bins, compost set up spontaneously combusting, and those happen in very large piles where if they're not being turned properly. The backyard compost setup is probably never going to do something like that. But some other ways to troubleshoot, if you're having a rotten odor smell, it's probably too wet and you need to turn the pile and add some dry material to it. If you're getting like an ammonia odor, then you probably are using too much grass clippings or food scraps, and that which have too much nitrogen, and you need to add some high carbon material. That happened to me once where I wasn't paying attention, there wasn't enough carbon in the bin, but it was easily corrected within a week. I just added lots of leaves to it, mixed it really well, and the situation corrected itself. Low temperature, sometimes people say to me, my compost pile never gets hot. Why does it never get hot? There's a couple of reasons. Maybe the pile is too small. Maybe it lacks enough water. Maybe it's not poorly aerated. Sometimes smaller piles in the cold water don't generate enough heat. But if you generate, your 3 by 3 by 3 pile and you're adding nitrogen-rich materials and carbon-rich materials, it should get hot. Okay, so then my next slide some people had questions about wildlife. We can take those now. So avoiding pests like rats and raccoons and insects. The most important thing that you need to do is, one, keep the pile covered, and then keep it turned. And when you put your vegetable scraps into the pile, you want to bury them all the way down into the pile. Like Benjamin knows, when he puts the food scraps onto the pile, he's got to cover completely all of the food scraps with leaves. Another thing you can do is just like dig a hole in the compost material and bury those vegetable scraps and make sure you're getting those leaves under. If you're having a problem with like rats or getting underneath the compost bin, you may want to consider composting on a concrete pad or a paved area. Okay, so using your compost, you will all at some point create wonderful compost, and at that point, the way you can use, there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. You can apply half an inch of compost to the soil surface, and then you want to till that compost into the top 6 inches of soil. And then just know that 3 to 5 cubic feet of compost provide about a ½ inch layer of compost over 100 square foot area if you're looking to figure out how much compost you would need. You could use compost as a mulch. It makes a great mulch around your plants. And then also know that you are making compost. You are not making soil in your compost bin. You cannot grow plants in compost alone. That's not how it works. You could mix compost in, create a nice mix of compost and maybe sand and some other media, but you cannot grow compost. You cannot grow plants in compost alone. You wouldn't want to, take a pot and fill it up with compost and grow plants in there. That material is going to go down very, very quickly, and also it's going to be a big soggy mess. Okay, so some other resources for you. This is one of my favorite ones. This one on the right, Composting to Reduce the Waste Stream. This is from Cornell. Just do a search for it in your browser. It'll come up quickly. This is the number, NRAES 43. Also, Rutgers has a nice home composting web sheet. Here's the number. Again, you can just do a search on this number here, FS81, home composting Rutgers, and it'll come right up. And then also, if you are more involved in school and community gardens, then I am doing another talk on Wednesday. This is the link for it, and I can go ahead and put it in the chat. If you want to register for that, that's at noon on, where is the chat? Here's the link to it. That's more for community and school gardens. Oh, sorry. Oh, that was the wrong link. I'm sorry. That's for the video. Hold on one second.
Michelle, I would also jump in and ask you if you want to start the poll.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'll go ahead and open up. Folks, I'm going to go ahead and open up the poll. You have a good amount. Somebody asked that we keep open the poll for longer, so you have a good amount of time to do it, but go ahead and if you want to get started, you can. So you can join that talk on Wednesday if you'd like to, and listen to me talk. Very, very similar. I'm just talking about composting in school and community gardens, which can be different management, which has different management issues. This is a really, really nice video. It's short, it's about 5 minutes. It's an overview of composting that my office did, God, over 10, 15 years ago. That link is also in the chat to this nice video. And then in summary, you know, I just want to repeat what I said at the beginning. Composting should not be stressful. It is an incredibly easy thing to do. In terms of our impact on the environment, it's one of the best things that we can do to reduce, you know, reduce our negative impacts, reduce garbage going to landfills, do good things for our soil. And you just need to remember that you need a lot of brown, and you need greens, you need to turn it, and you need to keep it moist, and you will have success. One thing I also wanted to mention before I finish up is sometimes people ask me, do I need to add any additives, or do I need to add, you know, when there's, the compost industry is huge, and you can be sold everything under the sun. You don't really need that stuff to get started. If you want, you could add, you know, a shovel full of soil to your compost pile to get started, but there's enough bacteria and fungi on what we're adding to the bin to get you started just fine. And the earthworms were just, it's unbelievable how they just arrive. It's like, you know, there's a party and somebody has put out, you know, a message to everybody, every earthworm in the neighborhood. They will just come to your compost bin. Okay, so any other questions? I see there's a lot of activity in the chat, which is great.
Yeah, there are a bunch of questions, Michele, that people have asked. One of the first ones was asking about, in terms of wildlife, since you can't add dog poo or cat poo to it, should you be concerned about wildlife waste within the compost pile?
I guess I don't understand the question. You should not be adding dog or cat waste to the compost bin. That is not appropriate.
Oh, I'm sorry, Michele. The question was, should there be concerns about like any wild animals getting in there and leaving their waste in there?
Oh, I see. You know, I mean, if there's a lot of that going on, it depends on how much. You know, an animal getting in there every now and then might, you know, there's probably enough good bacteria and organisms in your pile that they're gonna take on anything negative in that waste. If it's happening all the time, then yeah, you need to do something about that.
Okay. A lot of people were asking questions for recommendations of styles of compost bins.
Right.
So people were asking, like, is a 55-gallon drum good for using for a compost bin?
Sure. You just want to, again, keep in mind, you know, the volume issue. A 55-gallon drum is great. You know, you would want to poke some holes on the side. I'm just going back to where we're talking about different types of bins. The make your own 55-gallon drum, it may be a little bit difficult to get in there and turn the material in a 55-gallon drum, so you just want to make sure that you can do that you can do a really good job turning. But if you have the kind of system where you just want to stockpile your materials, add it to that 55-gallon drum, poke some holes in it, and let it cook, then that's a great thing to do. You just make sure that you keep it wet, keep it turned, and it has some drainage on the bottom. You want to make sure that it has some drainage on the bottom, and that should be fine. You'll have to hit a critical mass of material, you know, before that really starts cooking.
And speaking of the compost cooking, somebody was asking what's kind of about the average time that it takes to get to, you know, a finished compost. You know, I know with the variety of materials going into it.
Right. So it depends. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on the type of material that you're using. If you are using maple leaves and food scraps and you're doing a good job, you know, keeping up with if you're trying to hit the 30 to 1 Maple leaves are easier to decompose than they are, for example, oak leaves. You're turning it, you're keeping it moist. You could have compost in as little as a month, you know, but most people don't have those kinds of situations. You know, I'm a busy person. I've got 2 kids. I've got a job, a husband with a job, and we're lucky if we get the food scraps out to the compost bin. But if you really pay attention to it and you're monitoring it and using, you know, trying to hit those ratios, then it can happen very, very quickly.
And some people, in terms of the practice of creating the compost, wanted to know, is it okay to cover the compost with like a tarp, especially during dry seasons, to help retain moisture within it?
Yeah, definitely. That would be a good thing to do. You just want to make sure that you're turning it. You know, you want to still make sure that you're able to get in there, take the tarp off, turn it, and that's, yeah, that'd be fine.
Okay. And some other questions were just like, do you have any particular, I know we can't do it because with cooperative extension, but any particular brands to recommend in terms of compost bins or styles, like off the ground versus on the ground, or?
So here's what I would recommend. We can't, at Rutgers, we can't recommend specific products, but this is what I would say. This is the Earth Machine. I'm not, you know, recommending necessarily the Earth Machine, but this is a nice compost bin because for a backyard situation, because it has a nice big opening at the top, and then it actually has 2 doors on the bottom where you can access the finished compost. Also, it's the perfect volume, so once that gets filled up, you know, I know I'm hitting that critical mass of material so that things will properly compost. So I would say if you think that you're going to be continually adding vegetable scraps from your kitchen to your compost bin and then adding leaves, then you would want something like this, because it's designed for that finished compost to kind of drop out at the bottom. You know, so it really just depends on what you're doing. If you're going to have a couple of different bins, you maybe could have a turning bin. You could also set up something like this with wood pallets, you know, and have a couple of different systems going on if you are a serious composter.
Okay. One of the questions someone asked is, how long can you keep food scraps basically in a kitchen pail before you have to add it to the compost pile outside?
Well, I've actually tested that. It depends. How stinky do you want your kitchen? I've gone on vacation forgetting to empty the compost container and came back to not a good situation. So what we've learned to do is if the compost bin is too full, you know, you can freeze the fresh material, your fruits and veggies, and you know, when you come back from vacation, for example, which is what we should have done, then you can add it to your compost pile. So in my house, we eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. We cook a lot. So we're generating about 1 gallon of fresh material about every 2 days. And you saw the system that I have, and it works out. It works out just fine because the material, again, is constantly decomposing. I have a critical mass of material in there, so I have a good team in my compost bin. They do a good job.
One other common question we got, Michelle, had to deal with grass clippings. And people were asking, if you let the grass clippings dry out, do they then become a brown when you add it to your compost bin?
Oh, that's such a great question. Yes. So fresh grass clippings have about have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 20:1. But then if you let that dry out for a few days, that nitrogen leaches out, and it gets to be more like 50:1. Mm-hmm. So you have to be careful composting with fresh grass clippings, a lot of fresh grass clippings. You just want to make sure that you add a lot of carbon-rich material in there. That would be a great way to do it, is to just let those grass clippings dry out really, really well, and then you can add it to your compost bin.
Okay. Any concerns with any chemical additives like pesticides or anything on grass clippings?
Well, Well, yeah. So actually, no. So the Cornell document that I showed folks has a really nice section on the time it takes for your typical, herbicides and pesticides to break down. So if you're concerned about, grass clippings that have Roundup on it or something like that, it actually, that material breaks down very, very quickly. I think that guidance document said in about a month. So you don't have to be too concerned about putting that into the compost pile. I had seen one question on if I fill a bin with leaves in the fall, won't they decompose before I add them to my food scrap bin? No, they won't. Leaves left in the woods, they actually decompose very slowly on their own. Leaves decompose a lot faster when you add nitrogen-rich materials to them, like food scraps. So you saw my setup. I have my leaves kind of stockpiled on the side, and they just kind of hang out there. They've got lots of air around them. I wish they would decompose, but they don't. They stick around, and they'd probably still be good for you in the spring.
Okay. And there were a lot of questions regarding like fruit pits and seeds, and if those can be added to a compost pile, like a peach pit.
They can be. Right. I stopped adding peach pits to my compost bin years ago. I still see them. I still see them in my compost bin. Avocado pits, peach pits, they're just not going to break down. In a typical backyard compost bin, they're hardy, so it takes a long time for that to break down. I guess I could probably break them up, so that they break down sooner, but I don't have time for that kind of thing. So, you could put them in there and see how they do, but probably they won't break down. You'll be seeing those peach pits again.
One other question was how much water should you be adding, say, on a weekly basis to the compost pile?
How much water to add on a weekly basis? So it depends on your system, but what you want to do you want to do the squeeze test? So you add water to it, and then you mix it really, really well, and then you squeeze, and if about a drop or two of water comes out, then that's all. You've done a fine job.
And of course, use a glove when you're squeezing it. So, some of the other questions that were coming in, I'm just trying to go through them. People were having questions about how to, what's the best way to break down the material before going in. You had said cut it up, especially when they were asking for things like shredding paper or newspapers or even their food waste. Are there any sort of preferred methods to break that down before adding it to the pile?
Yeah, with newspaper and paper in general, just know that has a high, lignin content to a lot of cellulose. So you just want to shred that really, really well, and then you probably don't want to just compost with shredded newspaper. You should probably add some leaves to it along with your food scraps, because it takes a while to break down.
And I know we're going a little bit longer than the hour, and I want to thank everybody for bearing with us. But there have been a couple of questions regarding like any sort of systems for people who live in an apartment, or if there's any ideas for indoor composting.
So we did not cover indoor composting here, but people have a lot of, I don't vermicompost, but that's what you would look up. You would look up, do a search for vermicomposting, and that's a wonderful thing to do. If you're vermicomposting, you don't have to worry about having carbon-rich materials. You're just keeping a bin in your house with these tiny little red wiggler worms, and you can add your banana peels and your apple cores and all that to it, and not have to. The worms do all the work for you. So vermicomposting is wonderful. Just do a search online for vermicomposting. I know some counties actually sell utility authorities sell the vermicomposting bins, but this is a place where YouTube is your friend. There's also lots of great fact sheets on vermicomposting if you want to do this indoors. You probably can't compost as much material with your vermicomposter. We generate too much material in my house to vermicompost. I could probably do it as a supplement, but I'm not ready for that.
I'm just scrolling through the questions. A lot of talk back and forth on putting in hair if it's been dyed.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never had that question before, and I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have an answer for that. I just don't know enough about the, chemicals in hair dye. Yeah.
There have been a few questions regarding insect control, especially if you're doing an indoor, pail and you hold on to it for a while, i.e. fruit flies. But also, what kind of insect control in terms of like ants and flies for compost bins?
Well, the vermicomposting bins are completely contained, So they're pretty good in that, ants shouldn't be able to like get in there. They're completely closed. And then as far as, I just don't have enough experience with vermicomposting to be able to talk about that. You may have an issue with fruit flies, but the idea is for you to bury the material so that doesn't happen. There's newspaper in there. There's all this other stuff that you add into the vermicomposting bin. Yeah, well, I guess we need to talk on vermicomposting.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can put that on the list for the fall series if we want to do that in the fall. I think that's the majority of the questions. I'm trying to scroll through to see what we can find.
Oh, I see there's one from Susan. We have a 3-part compost bin in our garden that has not been used for the most part because no one knows how to use this setup. So that was, somebody was very ambitious. If it's like this bottom right 3-part system, these are great systems, but most of the time people don't know the right way to use them. If you look in that Cornell bulletin, they have a nice explanation of this system, but what you have to realize is one of these bins in the 3-part system, you're adding your material to. When you're done adding your material, when it fills up, you shut it down, and then you start a new pile. And then the finished compost is in like the 3rd bin. So you always have kind of 3 different systems going. One that's cooking, one where you're adding, and one where you're removing, where you're actively using the finished compost. That's how these systems are supposed to work. There should be boards here that where you shut down. And I see these a lot in community and school gardens. And what happens is someone knows how to use it, and they move on, and then it gets very messy very fast.
All right, we're getting a lot of great presentations, and thank you, Michele, for your help.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
So thank you very much for that. I don't know if you want to stop the recording, Michele, or if you want to take a few more questions. Getting hard-pressed to find.
I'm happy to take more questions, but since you brought it up, I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay. And remember, everyone, that we still have the poll going on.
The folks listening to the recording, thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.